heard me earlier that if I had no new jokes, you were going to do a variety of things. So I stole some new ones. But enough of this. We are fortunate tonight to have a panel, which is a distinguished panel, covering a variety then of facets of this marvelous airplane. Note, the airplane has a varied history. If you haven't been through the Hall of Liberators and that fine display, which was done by the people from Pueblo, you ought to avail yourself of that opportunity. Note then, remember, more B-24s were built than any other aircraft in World War II. Almost 19,000 of them. Built in 5 different plants throughout the country. 2 here within the immediate area that we're in, at Dallas, and of course at Fort Worth by Convair. Another plant then in Tulsa, and one in Fort Worth produced these airplanes. I remember that they're conceived and the first model then ground out within a short span of a year, 1939, before the war had begun. And note, I think it comes as no secret that it followed in the wake of the very popular B-17. And as a historian, I've been through the records of General Arnold and the rest, which are now in the Library of Congress. And there's no doubt there was considerable partiality to the B-17. And there was considerable reluctance to go to the B-24. Note, 1939, when this airplane then is designed, we find that we had 16 4-engine bombers in the inventory. There were 16 B-17As. I mean, one of the most amazing things, of many things about the B-24, is of course the fact that it is then designed, conceived, and flown within a period of less than a year. Amazing to think of this. We find then that it enjoys a variety of uses in a variety of theaters. A bomber, a photo-recce airplane, a transport, used in many configurations, used by then many theaters, used by many services, used by many nations. What we'll do tonight then is we'll proceed to discuss the facets of this with this panel in front of us. At the end of our discussion, we'll welcome your questions. There are microphones situated around the hall, and we'll call upon you, those who would like to ask questions, to pose them to our panel. Let me introduce them to you, and I'll begin on the far left, my far left, your far right. This gentleman is Al Blue, a retired government civil servant from Washington. And I think many of you know that he began research into this in 1960 in an effort to learn what had happened to his brother, who was killed, a navigator in B-24s. Al then has written several histories, many of you are familiar with them, of particularly bomb groups, of the 491st and the 492nd, and his volume, the B-24 Liberator, a history, although published in 1976, is out of print now, unfortunately, and is still pretty much the standard work on the aircraft. Al then presents a perspective then from a writer and a student who's looked at this airplane. A man who's not flown in it as an operator, but a man whose knowledge of it is wide. Immediately then, on the next gentleman is Mr. Joe Famé. Mr. Famé brings to us considerable expertise then from the technical end of it. We find that he served before his retirement as president of Convair, and the period we're interested in, most interested in, we find that he was an engineer then with Consolidated Aircraft. In 1942, he became the chief project engineer on the B-24, served as the representative of Convair on the B-24 engineering committee, dealt with the production of this in these 5 major plants. We find in 1944, he went overseas and became the chief advisor to General Doolittle on the use and operation of the B-24 in the 8th Air Force. Following that, he had a distinguished career with Convair and now has his own consulting company in California. The gentleman in the middle is Vice Admiral John Hayward, graduate of the Naval Academy of the class of 1930. Admiral Hayward had a distinguished career in test and instrument development before the war began. And we find then Admiral Hayward, in terms of this airplane, took it and was the commander of VB-106 in the Pacific, and for 2 years then participated in a variety of uses in it by the U.S. Navy. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Munda, Bougainville, Hollandia, so forth. Worked very closely with the 5th Army Air Force in New Guinea in this period. Probably has more experience working with the Army and the Army Air Corps in this period than any other naval officer. Not forgetting our British friends who gave the name Liberator to the aircraft. The next gentleman then is Group Captain John Musgrave of the Royal Air Force. John served as an Army officer first, participated in the Battle for France, was evacuated in that miraculous evacuation at Dunkirk, and then saw the light and joined the RAF. Taught to fly and finished his flight training, in effect, while the Battle of Britain was still going on. Then transitioned to Liberators and had extensive experience then flying the British models, as they would term them, Liberator 2, Liberator 3, and Liberator Mark 6. Flying them in the Middle East, out of Palestine and Egypt, flying them in India, and then coming back and flying them out of the mud in Italy. Brings us a different perspective than how another nation. Final gentleman, Major General Ramsay Potts, under whom I worked at the rank of captain. He says if he'd met me earlier, he could have done even more with me had we begun earlier. I think I'm one of his failures, however. He's too kind to say that. John Potts, a native Tennessean, commissioned in 1941, went overseas with the 93rd, and of course then flew on the Poesti mission, about which we'll hear more this evening, I hope. Then we find commanded both, and some of you know him, of course, from this role, commanded both the 453rd and the 389th. Flew in Coastal Command, has the distinction of his aircraft shooting down 2 Ju-88s, was it not, rather than 87s? 88s, with Coastal Command in the airplane that he was the commander of. Became the director of bomber operations for the 8th Air Force in 1944, and has had a distinguished career since then in a variety of assignments. Is a leading Washington lawyer today. Quite enough. Not enough to be said about these fine gentlemen, but enough to furnish you an introduction and see where we start. You might remember we first begin at the beginning, I guess. Comes from Alice in Wonderland, does it not? No reference intended, however. But we ought to start with Mr. Fame and have Mr. Fame, remember, Convair and involved in the engineering here. And Mr. Fame would like to comment on the early problems with the engineering design of this in 1939. The problems with the Davis wing, the controversy over its usage. Mr. Fame, I wonder what you'd like to say to start this off, Joe.
Thank you, Jack. We were in a very interesting period, 37, 38, 39, when Hap Arnold had just been recently appointed, and he went to Roosevelt, who at that time said we need 10,000 airplanes, and people thought, where did he come from? The French were having British had the world's greatest navy, and Arnold told Roosevelt, he says, we better have long-range bombers. And that's what we done. B-17s and the B-24s. That's the last time I say B-17. The design of the B-24 really it started with the French known as LB-30, Land Bomber Model 30, and it did not at that time have the high altitude requirements that we had to get into. I found out about later on. The French, of course, had an agreement with Britain. If they capitulated, Britain would take over the design. I was not in the project office at the time when the French had a specification, but I did get there at the time the British arrived, with a gentleman named Fred Firth, and we went over the first specifications for the LB-30. And we had a very fine relationship. Of course, we gave some to the British, and before we gave them all, we took some of them back, because 1941, everything else happened. So the design was not too difficult because we had flown the Davis wing full scale on a Model 31 seaplane. At the time, being on engineering on the board and working on all kinds of parts of the airplane, it didn't seem like a great big job because we had 60 engineers in engineering, so it wasn't hard to communicate. We had 1,200 people in the whole plant, and I think 300 people for the office and engineering included. So we could get around and talk pretty easy, no computers to screw it up. And so we had Frank Fink, who was my boss, no longer with us, but Frank did it all by pencil, and he named the people to go on this project, and he named the schedule, and he did the whole thing. So to get the airplane flying in a year rather than, which was promised by Major Fleet, we had to devise a few things to make sure the wheels didn't come off, as John says. We took the wing off the seaplane, changed the center section, put on 4 engine pods instead of 2. We took the outer panels. We took the double tail off of the seaplane, and it fit very well onto the fuselage. The whole idea was that 8,000 pounds of bombs were going to be carried in the seaplane, and we also, Fleet committed that we were going to have 8,000 pounds of bomb in a B-24. And it had to be, the seaplane was known as the ugly guppy, or the guppy, the old fat-bellied seaplane, and the B-24 took a little bit of that with it. It could not be designed as beautifully as we liked it, but it did and would carry the bombs. As I say, it was not too big a problem, so in about mid-March of 39, the mock-up had been completed. Lieutenant Putt came out with a group of people, completed the mock-up inspection. The letters came through from the War Department, and we were on our way to build an airplane. And as you know, December 29th, 1939, we made our first flight. Does that cover it? We'll get into the Davis wing a little later.
Al Blue, you want to say something about then when the R-1830 engine came on? Note the original didn't have the R-1830.
Well, the Model 31, Joe, that had 1830s, didn't it? The Model 31? Or had the right engines?
Yeah.
Well, Ladin wanted, I believe, the R-1830s because they represented, as a twin-row engine, less frontal air resistance. He felt that he had to protect the design of the wing. I know he wrote me years ago saying that he was very proud of the fact that he was able to design the engine pods so that they did not interfere with the airflow over the Davis wing section. I would like to say just a word about
Please
Davis,
do,
if I may. Back in the 1920s, the design of airfoils was more a black art than a science. And Davis was a product of this area. He was born in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, son of a paper mill owner. He did not receive formal training in aeronautical engineering, but he was stricken by aviation and he could afford to pursue it. This resulted in 1931, his theory that you could design a wing using a certain mathematical formula that, whereas if you crank in the right values, you can design a wing with great range or great speed or great lift and so forth, whatever the customer wants, you can have. And And when he went to Consolidated in 1937, that's what he came with. He didn't come with a wing. He came with the claim that he could design any wing that they wanted. And to make a somewhat convoluted story short, when Ladin and Fleet, Major Fleet, decided to give Davis a chance to design the wing, they gave him this design that they had already made for the Model 31. The shape of the Davis wing was not Davis's idea. That was already designed by Consolidated. And when they told him, since they were talking about a seaplane at the time, and a possible replacement for the PBY, they wanted long range and they wanted speed. And that's what Davis went away and designed. They, of course, tested the wing. It was proved very satisfactory, particularly on the first test flight. I've always felt that the controversy, if there was a controversy over the Davis wing, was probably Major Fleet's idea. It was great publicity. It generated all sorts of articles in the newspapers and periodicals at the time. And the very fact that we're still talking about it today, 50 years later, proves that Major Fleet's idea was a success. Certainly the Germans and the Italians were. They couldn't wait to get their hands on the Davis wing so that they could find out what this mystery was all about. When they did, as a matter of fact, Anthony Ferri, the head of the Italian research establishment, was awakened in the middle of the night and said, "We've got a Davis wing." And they tested it at Guidonia for 3 days. And at the end, as Ferri said, why on earth would anybody build a wing like this? They couldn't figure out that there was anything unique or secret about it.
Thank you, Al. Admiral Hayward, maybe you were the first of the three operators here with Group Captain Musgrave and General Potts might like to comment on the flight characteristics of this. How different was it to fly then with the Davis wing than other airplanes you've been accustomed to? You've been accustomed to carrier landings on early aircraft carriers. How about the flight characteristics?
Well, first, I'd like to say they don't know anchors away in Fort Worth, and the Navy didn't fly a seaplane. We flew Liberators, the B-24D. A lot of the people who are here that I talked to thought the Navy had a PB-4Y Humpty Hump, but you will find that we had 101, BB-101, 102, 104, 106, B-24s. Now, the history of that, as I pointed out before, was Admiral King and General Arnold agreed on this particular switch. The Army Air Corps wanted to build a strange sort of thing up in the Renton Lake plant. And the Navy had been having a lot of trouble with PBYs, and so the Navy was going to build another seaplane, but in return for turning the Renton Lake plant over to the Army Air Corps, why the U.S. Navy got B-24Ds, which we flew in the Pacific. The B-24 was an ideal airplane for the Pacific. We had long legs, and our job, of course, was reconnaissance and attack. It was a BPB. There was sort of a sensitive feeling on the Air Corps' part that if the Navy wasn't supposed to still do any bombing, at least not on the land at that particular time. But it quickly disappeared in the Solomon Island campaign, because if you remember, some of our greatest defeats at sea occurred in the Solomon Islands because we really didn't have long-range air reconnaissance. The PBY was very vulnerable, but our sectors out of Guadalcanal went 1,000 miles. A lot of the missions were 15, 16 hours with 2 500-pound bombs, and of course we were to make sure that many Japanese ships that came down the slot, that our Marine friends and General Twining and the people at Guadalcanal knew it. The B-24 was not an easy airplane to fly. We had many experienced people as my plane commanders. A great deal of them, number of them had been through combat, had come from the Philippines. We have a very famous man in the audience tonight, my favorite Dagwood Davis, who led the torpedo attack at night with a PBY against the Japanese transports in the Midway engagement. He was one of our B-24 pilots, and they were all well versed in instruments, flying, and I must say in those days, you really had to know the gauges. They'd taken off with a B-24 from the airstrip in Guadalcanal with 3,300 gallons of gas, and 2 500-pound bombs was enough to wake you up any day. I mean, it was always a thrill. As a matter of fact, until I read back some of the things, I should have been much more frightened than I was. But it gave the Navy a tremendous aspect about long-range reconnaissance and the ability to give the intelligence to our ships. One of the instances was with regards to the submarines. The submarines are known as the silent service, and they sure are silent. But we would come on ships, and we wouldn't be able to communicate with our submarines. We finally went over to Milne Bay, and we stole some Army Air Corps VHF sets off this big pile. They always had lots of spares, the Air Force always has. We put them on the submarines. And one of the biggest successes of the war was that one of our planes on the run from the Solomons to Truk came on a Japanese convoy, and the submarine Pito was one of the ones that had the VHF set on, and we were able to tell them about the convoy, and now Admiral Nelson was the captain of the Pito, and he proceeded to sink this convoy. But it gave the Navy some legs that were most important. Now our B-24 was a little different. I listened to the first Air Corps propaganda that the first airplanes we had guns up in the nose that a Swiss Carillon player would have played and shoot anybody. And they always told me we were going to go so high and so fast, nobody was going to lay a finger on us from the nose. Well, we found out that wasn't true, and we put turrets on them, and we used them very successfully and contributed not only in this first phase, because the second phase we have what we call a B-24 Ace, because there's a patrol plane commander in the audience from B-117, Sutton, who his crew shot down 5 enemy aircraft, but my fighter friends don't say that that's an ace, but we do in the B-24 family anyway. And as an aeroplane, it was a tremendous success for the Navy. Now, one of the disadvantages and why they changed it was something that the people asked. We had the high-altitude engines from the B-24D. We had the turbo supercharger, and people thought that you should do the ASW work right over the water and everything else. So the PB-4Ys, after they put the other engines in, had the sea-level engine, and then they went to the single tail. But on the whole, from our experiences in the Navy, the B-24 was a tremendous success, and it did a job that that other unnamed aircraft could never have done in the Pacific.
Thank you, Admiral. I guess I should say thank you. I'm not sure, but how about Group Captain John Musgrave? How about the RAF experience, particularly as flight characteristics? John?
Well, thank you very much. Could I just interrupt to say what an honor and pleasure it is for me to be here, and why somebody from the Royal Air Force might be here. There were some 20,000 liberators produced, and some 2,000 to 2,500 of those liberators found their way to the Royal Air Force or to British Commonwealth Air Forces, which is about 10% of production, and it is indeed an honor for me here to have 20% of this top table. It's a great honor and pleasure for me personally, but even more to be here as a representative of the Royal Air Force and the Commonwealth Air Force people who flew with me, and I'm sure that a lot of them are more qualified and experienced than me, but at least I'm here tonight to try and speak for them. We were talking about the Davis Wing. Well, when we got our liberators in 1941, we were terribly impressed with the records of the Davis Wing, because that was going to give our aircraft range and endurance, and that's what at that time we were looking for in both the bomber role and the maritime role. To us as junior aircrew, we could not understand why a wing so aesthetically beautiful in appearance could have underneath it a fuselage that looked like a rail freight car. But nevertheless, it proved to be a splendid aircraft and is wide in application with our air forces as with the United States Air Force and the Navy. I won't go into great detail now about what we thought of it, but in Alan Blue's book he says at one stage it was an uncomfortable and awkward aircraft. When we started to get into the Liberator as RAF crews, our impression was what a wonderful spacious aircraft and how comfortable it is inside.
Thank you, John. John Potts, you flew Ds as well as later models. How about the flying characteristics in terms of your experience?
Well, I think that my experience as a pilot with the B-24 was fairly typical of the experience of a lot of B-24 pilots in this respect. Until I flew the B-24, I had only flown some outmoded, obsolescent, single-engine aircraft. And I never flew it, up until later on, I never flew a twin-engine airplane to transition into the B-24. I was sent from an observation unit flying O-52s, which was probably the worst airplane that anybody ever built. And sent right to the B-24 or B-24 unit, the 93rd, being formed up, and after 17 hours of some instruction in it, I was turned loose. But I think that was typical of a lot of pilots who were coming through and going into the B-24. I asked myself why I was asked to be on this panel, because there are a lot of other people who had a lot of experience with the B-24 in the 8th Air Force and the 15th Air Force. And then I sort of began to tick off in my own mind the kinds of missions that my unit had done with the B-24. We flew it on high altitude formation missions from England and from North Africa against targets in Germany and Austria. We flew it on a low-level mission against the Ploesti oil fields, August 1st, 1943. My squadron flew with the Coastal Command for about 7 weeks prior to the North African invasion, trying to suppress submarines, mainly down in the Bay of Biscay. We flew missions where we were carrying supplies. I flew the B-24 on a night bombing mission against shipping in the port of Benghazi. And finally, all in all, I had about 1,400 hours in the B-24. Having come from the O-52 to the B-24, I thought it was an absolutely fantastic airplane. It seemed to me it was pretty easy to fly once you sort of checked out in it. And we even got to the point, and I'm sure there are a lot of pilots sitting out there tonight who will tell you that this is something they really enjoyed, where you come, make a steep turn over the airfield, swoop down, and then pull it up in a chandelle, lower the landing gear, and come around, emulating our little friends. Well, let me comment, if I may, on this Ploesti mission, which a lot of people seem to have an interest. And I won't go into too much detail, but I will say this. We practiced a lot at low level in the desert down in bases near Benghazi, and we were skimming the ground, and we had about 4 airplanes that got so banged up that they were taken out of service because they would hit the sand and damage the Bombay doors, and in a couple of cases they even damaged the engines. So we had very realistic practices for this mission. We were down there preparing in July. It was very, very hot and very sandy and dusty, and the sandstorms were blowing up, and it was impossible to maintain the airplanes during the day. You had to do all of the maintenance at night. We were not stood down, so we were going on various missions to bomb Messina and the ports that the Germans were pouring reinforcements into North Africa into. So we're still doing that at the same time we were getting ready for this mission. 179 airplanes from 5 different groups. 3 groups had come down from England, detached from the 8th Air Force, and 2 groups were already there in the Air Force, the Desert Air Force. The 376 and the 98, I think, were the numbers. Keith Compton commanded one of them and Killicaine the other one. The commanders of the 3 groups from England were Jack Woods with the 389th, Addison Baker, the 93rd, and I was a squadron commander then in the 93rd, and Leon Johnson commanding the 44th. 179 airplanes took off. 11 aborted, and so didn't make the mission for one reason or another. As I say, it was difficult to maintain the engine, so I'm sure that these were all legitimate aborts. 3 airplanes crashed on the way out. We were very heavily loaded. We had 6,000 pounds of bombs. We had an extra Bombay tank. We topped off, so everybody had a full load of gas. And the gunners, although they were not supposed to do it, would sneak a lot of extra ammunition aboard, and not realizing they were jeopardizing their own safety by putting so much load on board. Well, made the attack. I won't go into any details about that. You've all heard about it, read about it. We lost something like 57 airplanes out of the 163 that made the attack, which was a very, very high level of loss. Every airplane that made it back, some didn't make it back all the way, they landed in Malta or somewhere else, had severe battle damage. And we had a hard time scraping up airplanes to go on the next missions we were ordered on. That was a very dramatic mission. It took a plane like the B-24 with its extra range to make that flight from those airfields in North Africa into Romania. I can comment later on, Jack, about some other aspects. Turn it back.
Thank you, General Potts. Incidentally, there are going to be 2 airplanes on the field, 2 B-24s tomorrow at Carswell. Actually, one's the LB-30, belongs to the Confederate Air Force, and however, there'll be a B-24 there, both on static display at Carswell. Again, some of the famous names, and as General Potts indicates, Ploesti, Susie Q with General Johnson on board, will be here on Sunday night at the dinner. Lady Be Good, 376th airplane, as you know, met a difficult fate and finally discovered there in the Libyan desert in 1958. Maybe the most famous airplane in terms of at least its saga, the finding of the crew bodies and so forth. And of course, you 376 people also know that at the Air Force Museum you have Strawberry Bitch, do you not, there on display all the time. Joe Faume, how about, as reports would come back, as General Potts has indicated, of problems that they would have, particularly in maintenance and so forth, how would this affect the production line, Joe? Would you make modifications? Were able to make them?
Yeah, there were a lot of modifications made. One I was just thinking about when speaking about the desert, I know we had a crash call that we needed to get filters put into the cells of the engines, and I don't know if you ever got them over there, but we made them almost overnight, and they were shipped. They probably went to the Pacific. We all tried. If you're talking production of the airplane really got underway when Roosevelt appointed General Knudsen to head up a production committee of executive presidents of companies, in which Donald Douglas and Dutch Kindleberger and Harry Woodhead from Consolidated then, and himself and Henry Ford II. Henry Ford I was on, but he was too hard to get along with, so they asked him to step aside. Henry Ford II was in it, and they, in turn, set up a committee which is called an engineering subcommittee, in which all engineering, all the master change records, as you fellows may remember about, all the changes were engineered, of course, at Convair, Consolidated. Then it was dispersed to this engineering group down in the Spreckles building in Broadway in San Diego, and they in turn distributed to their companies, Tulsa, North American, Dallas, and even Fort Worth, and to the Ford Motor Company. And that committee was in existence for a long time. There was a tooling committee also that was set up so that the interchangeability could be maintained as well as possible. Getting the people to work together it really was an easy task when we look back at it. I'm sure it would be easy today if we had such an emergency, but certainly that was the thing that brought people together. There was difficulty in trying to tell Henry that you could not have this tolerance this big, and that the floorboards of the Model T were not usable again. You had to really make it that way. And I had the privilege one day of running into Mr. Ford Sr. at this big center section fixture where they moved 4 milling fixtures up against the center section, and in about 3 or 4 minutes, all the pads for the engine mounts were done. It was fantastic. And let me tell you, we never made a change on that in the whole time, because that tool would have gone out the window. But Henry Ford was very concerned about the safety of the airplane, and he finally got people in to recognize that you really had to fly it, you couldn't keep it on the ground, and that's what it was going to take, a safe airplane. As far as the other contractors, they're airplane builders, they were great builders, and we really worked along very well. I think that covers pretty much what we got into.
Al, do you want to comment from your perspective?
Well, I'd like to ask a question of Joe. It's fairly well known that the Air Force, Wright Field, and so forth had a very difficult time refusing any request from a combat theater commander who said he wanted this or that in his B-24, and they would turn to Consolidated and say, put it in. As we all know, what this was doing was growing the weight of the B-24, and that, in the end, was its biggest fault. It just got too heavy. And I'd like to ask Joe Fahmy, Joe, who was in charge back at the ranch in San Diego that could have held up his hand and say, look, guys, you're not making this aircraft better, you're making it worse. We just can't keep loading it down like this and tearing down its performance.
Well, of course, Mac Ladden was, when he got gone from chief engineer to the general manager, he couldn't put up his hands, and I think he did. Harry Sutton was then the chief engineer of everything in production and R&D. He was very sensitive to this. He wrote lots of letters to the Air Force saying this is what it does. In the project office, I had one aerodynamics guy assigned to me whose his total job was every time an MCR or master change came in, he had to evaluate the effect on performance, weight balance, and so forth. And these things were accumulated and sent back. There were many meetings that took place at Wright Field. I remember one which Colonel Brentnall and Colonel Frank Cook and Bob Evans, who was the project engineer officer of the B-24, and the Boeing people came down. We sat across the table and said, what can we do about helping get the weight off? Because the 17 was having similar problems. They had the bigger wing, it didn't affect so much, but Anyway, we came away with, I forget how many thousand pounds that could come off. I came home, I told Frank Fink, my boss, I said, gee, it looks like we're going to get some of this weight off and get some of our performance. And I think I no sooner finished that, the telegram comes through from right field, don't change anything. This is understandable because each of the theater commands had their particular thing. But to build a composite airplane to take care of all those requirements really affected the performance of the airplane. And I just don't know to this day what we could have done more to do that except refuse to build them. Production was, I guess, number one in those days, and as we got going, we had to produce the airplanes. And to make changes, it was very, very difficult. So to get the weight out would take a lot more changes. But the commands required certain things, and the airplane was a composite.
Thanks much, Joe. Joe Potts, and then we'll go to the other two operators.
Well, the initial airplane was actually that we got to fly in England, B-24D, was a fairly primitive airplane, really. Of course, there was no pressurization. It didn't have waste windows. You just stuck the guns out the side and started firing. I can remember in the first version we had a top turret with an oxygen outlet that was in the bomb bay, and the tube had to be connected to that. So whenever the top turret gunner would swivel, he'd pull his oxygen line loose. And so we made a modification right there on the base and put those oxygen bottles right on the bottom of the turret so they would swing around with the turret. It absolutely amazed me, though, the way that we would run into some different tactic that the Luftwaffe was using, and we would then say, well, we have to have a nose turret. We tried sticking guns out the front first, and then we thought, no, we've got to have a nose turret, and we got it. I mean, they modified the thing and gave us a nose turret, and then we got attacks coming up from the bottom under the airplane, and then we have to have a ball turret, and they gave us a ball turret. And finally, we were getting attacks. These twin-engine German fighters would sit off out of range, about 50 calibers in the back, and would lob these shells into us and rockets. And so we said, we got to have something to counter that. We need rockets on the back of our airplane. Well, you're not going to get that, we were told. That's the end. Now, you guys have got to settle down and use what you got. But it truly was a remarkable performance on the part of the engineers and the people who were producing that airplane, that they could respond so quickly to our changing needs. And true, the airplane did get heavy and heavier. And I'll say this about it. It was a marvelous airplane in the European theater if you could fly formation at about 22,000 feet or below. But in the early days, the 8th Air Force headquarters was completely dominated by B-17 types. They didn't know anything about the B-24, and so they would plan missions for us as if we were B-17s. And they'd try to put us up at 26,000 feet or 26.5, and especially as we got heavier, hell, we couldn't fly formation up there. The difference between the stalling speed and the all-out speed sometimes would be about 5 to 7 knots. And you didn't have any leeway. And once you slipped a little bit, you were out of formation, and you stayed out of formation. You couldn't catch up. Now, I will say this. I was assigned to the 8th Air Force headquarters, and by a fluke, at the end of December 1944, I was assigned early December. Orville Anderson liked something I told him about how to plan the missions. He said, okay, Potts, you're going to be the director of bombing operations. And from that day on, the B-17s were put on the targets that had the heaviest flak. fly higher, you see. And I brought the B-24s down to about 22,000. And so help me God, if you look at the record, you'll see that in January, February, March, April of 45, the accuracy of the B-17 units increased dramatically, and our accuracy during that period was much greater than the B-17 units.
Thank you. How about the RAF experience, John Musgrave, and then we'll go to Admiral Hayward. Go ahead.
Well, I think looking at it in the broad, modifications and amendments were the biggest problem at first when we got our first Liberators, because they were not really war machines. They were designed as that, but they had not got their armament. And we were so anxious to get the aeroplanes that we got them over to Britain and we started installing armament, inadequate armament, as it turned out, in Britain. Later on, as things developed, the much more complete war machine came from stateside to the European or the Middle East theatres. It was my experience down at out in the field was that as new aeroplanes in the sort of kind of middle of the war, as new aeroplanes came out, we would be surprised to find certain modifications which had been made often enough. We didn't know why. Clearly, it was as a result of somebody else's experience and demand. And it was rather like taking delivery of a new model automobile. What's this thing for? What's that switch for? We've never seen it before. But we got used to it, and it was fine. Towards the end of the war in Italy, when there had been more Liberators produced than anybody could use, the RAF, I'm talking now about the last 6 months of the war in Europe, the RAF had an absolute plethora of Liberators delivered to them, and we were converting old Wellington bomber squadrons into Liberators squadrons at a rate of knots. But there we were doing a certain amount of demodification in that we, a strange thing that you're taking what has been an expensive additional modification to an airplane to make it suit your requirements. But looked at in retrospect, it was the way to do it. Make a modification in the field rather than confuse people way back in San Diego or Fort Worth.
At what altitude, John, would you normally use the B-24 by the RAF in the Middle East? What altitude would normally be?
In the maritime role, which there were some operations, of course they were low-level operations in the main, but we in the bombing role operated somewhere between 8 and 15,000 feet. We had a similar experience, I remember, in this sort of period, 1942 and 43, when, as General Potts has said, the B-17s were put up top and the B-24s were down below. In the RAF, the B-24s were up at about 12 to 15,000 feet, and our quite strong force of Wellington bombers were down about 8 or 10,000 feet, and they always said they were what protected us from our losses, because they were operating down below and taking the flak from us.
Admiral Hayward?
Well, in the Navy, we long ago found out you can't hit a ship from 15,000 feet dropping a bomb. I mean, our experience was that most of our shipping attacks were made at low altitude. I doubt very seriously whether we made one high altitude bombing attack during the whole time of our deployment in the Pacific. The oxygen equipment, most of our, we had radar in our aircraft, and the oxygen equipment wasn't used as frequently as you would in high altitude bombing. And our maintenance problems, well, you know what the Solomon Islands and New Guinea were like. We had spare part problems, of course. The Air Force sat across our lines of supply in the Solomon Islands. But once we got over to New Guinea, where the Air Force was, in NADZAB, we didn't have as much logistic problem. But on the whole, we were able to operate and cover our sectors the whole time of our deployment. We never were out of aircraft to cover the necessary sectors, which we had 8 sectors every day, and we usually had 2 squadrons, Harry Sears in 104 in the Solomons and my squadron 106. And we would fly 8 aircraft to these ranges every day. And we had very good success in keeping the aircraft going under very bad conditions too, let me say, from a weather point of view. The pilots were very well trained in instrument flying. If they weren't going to survive in that situation. But on the whole, the modifications, the best turret we had was the Urco turret, and we had very good success in shooting aircraft down with it, and we had good success in sinking ships at low altitude attacks. Of course, you must remember that the B-25 over in the 5th Air Force in the battle up there did the first real skip bombing with the B-25s, but we had been doing it with the B-24s. Now, a lot of people say that wasn't conducive to a long life and a happy old age, and it wasn't. But the Solomon Islands were entirely different than New Guinea. The Solomon Islands, we had Nate 20 and we had the Marines as our boss, but you had to bring the Emperor's hat back to get a medal then. I had a pilot that made a low attack on a Terasuki class destroyer and had a great deal of difficulty getting him an air medal. But it was a great deal different in New Guinea than General. But the facts are that that was a good operating airplane for the use that the Navy put it to. And as you look at the rest of the war and the work they did out, and that when we had come home, you take the other squadrons that went out and the ships that they sank and the aircraft they shot down, the long range and the ability to go and to be available was important. Now, sure, it's called a boxcar, I guess. It looked very unwieldy, and it wasn't easy to fly when it was heavily loaded. But on the whole, I think my pilots and the rest of the Navy would say that the thing was a very great success, and a tribute to Joe Family and the people who designed it. And I don't know whether I can fly that one out at the field now, but I think I'd like to.
Would you like to continue on your maintenance problems? When General Potts and I were walking this afternoon through that fine display the Pueblo people have done, the Hall of the Liberators, he pointed out a picture in which there was tremendous sand blowing. And General Potts said this is about normal for that North African littoral. How about your problems both there, and I think the RAF may want to comment. General Potts, how would you keep them operational?
I'll tell you a story that really was very unusual. After the Casablanca conference, General Arnold came back from that conference and came back through Cairo and North Africa. And we had gone down right after the invasion of North Africa and were stationed up near Tobruk on a kind of a high plateau there where there wasn't anything except just dead hard pan. We'd just come from England, where we really enjoyed going to the pubs, meeting attractive young women, and even though we had to fly against the Luftwaffe without much fighter escort, we kind of liked it. And we got down there, we lived in these tiny little A tents, 8 sea rations, and thought life was pretty miserable. General Arnold came through and assembled us all together and said, now I want to tell you something. You fellas are really lucky to be here with all this sunshine and this wonderful weather. If you were in England, those poor guys up there have to fly in the most horrible weather, and they're meeting the cream of the Nazi Air Force, the German Air Force. You're lucky as hell to be down here. So we scratched our heads and thought, well, maybe his staff didn't brief him very well. Sometime later, we were sent back to England, And lo and behold, General Arnold shows up to give a talk to us in the hangar. And again, his staff hadn't briefed him very well. He said, now look, you guys, you think you've got it tough up here, but look, let me tell you about those poor bastards down in the desert. Well, I suppose there were advantages and disadvantages in one theater as against another. But frankly, I think I preferred to be flying out of England, because once you got back, at least you could be a little bit comfortable, and you could enjoy the sunshine when it would come through occasionally. But I want to tell you one story that I haven't told in public before. I had a co-pilot when we were training in the United States named Shannon. And Shannon was a marvelous natural leader and a gung-ho, aggressive, fine pilot who led his crew very well. And when, just before we went overseas, I was made a squadron operations officer and turned the crew over to Shannon. Shannon's crew, which was my old airplane, was the first B-24 crew to finish a tour in England. And he was getting ready to come home with his crew. We got a call from headquarters of Bobbyton, actually, and they ordered that we send a plane down to we didn't know what it was for. General Timberlake, who was then Colonel Timberlake, commanding the 93rd, asked me, he said, well, why don't we send Shannon? He's finished his tour. Maybe they want to send him to the States on a bond fundraising tour. I said, that's great. So we sent Shannon down there, and the mission he had to fly was to fly General Frank Andrews, who was the ranking American commander in Britain at that time. General Eisenhower was still in North Africa. On an inspection trip to Iceland, which was under General Andrews' command. Now, I have to tell you this. When we made Shannon the airplane commander, we did it because he was a superb formation flying pilot, but he had one weakness. He had never been able to distinguish between the A signal and the N signal and the M signal in making a radio range instrument approach. But we didn't have any radio ranges in England, and so it didn't seem to matter. It turned out that on this flight up to Iceland, the weather was very, very bad. General Andrews insisted on going anyway, even though when he got over Prestwick, they told him to land. He said, no, proceeding. And they got up there, and he had to make an instrument letdown on a radio range, and they crashed into the mountain, and everybody was killed except one man, who was the tail gunner. But if we had known what the mission was, we never would have let Shannon go down there and fly it. But there you are. And sometimes it pays for commanders to tell you what it is they have in mind. That's the lesson of that story.
On that trip, of course, General Arnold had gone on to China, and while he was in India before they launched to China, being the great poobah from Washington, they brought in all the gem merchants and the rug merchants to see what the man from Washington wanted to buy. Arnold records in his diary he didn't buy anything, but there was a colonel who later became a four-star general, was with him, and he'd been away from a paymaster a long time. He'd been fighting in Java, and he had pockets full of flight pay, and he bought 2 of these and 3 of these and 4 of these and sent them back home. They sent an airplane every week back to Washington to keep Arnold conversant with correspondence. So he sent these jewels, this colonel did, back to his wife, who then lived in Washington. Arnold and the group went on to China. When they returned 10 days later to India, there was a telegram from the man's wife in Washington. It told a great deal about their marital relations, about, as well as other things. The telegram was a very short one, only 4 words relating to these jewels. They're glass, you ass. Group Captain Musgrave, please go ahead. I'm sorry, John. No, would you like to say something about maintenance, and then we'll go to Admiral Hayward, please.
No, I can reflect what General Potts has said about the difficulty of servicing in the desert and the sand that cause such problems. We had experience of operating them in Africa, in the sand, and also in India, in some very difficult monsoon, typhoon-type climate like we've been having around here recently. And also in Britain. But I never remember the filters coming to us. I'm sure they must have gone to the Navy. But of the 3 conditions, I really think that people would find it easier operating servicing the aeroplanes in the British climate rather than North Africa and India. We used to get appalling heat on the aeroplanes with no covers at all. That was a great problem. On another maintenance aspect, I was put in mind of it when I arrived in Fort Worth yesterday. I've read that there were certain production problems of producing spare parts for the Liberator when the parts were produced in one of the half-dozen plants where these parts were produced, that they didn't always fit exactly the particular place on the aeroplane where they were expected to go. And I was put in mind of this situation yesterday. I remember an occasion in India when a particular part of the airplane went astray and we had to replace it, and with difficulty were able to get the spare part. And I was talking to our flight sergeant who eventually managed to get this part and eventually managed to fit it in because it didn't really fit exactly. And I said to him after he'd finished, well, that's very good, you seem to have made a good job of that, but it still looks a bit rough. And he was so affected by the heat and frustration, he flung down his cap and he said he'd heard about where these Liberators were being made far away from India, way back in the States. And he understood that they were being made by Ford. And he said, what do you expect when you're getting aeroplanes made by a lot of automobile mechanics and cowboys?
I have a comment, particularly with reference to the General's getting the operation and what the mission is. We were on Guadalcanal at this particular time, and life was pretty tough. And there's been a bombing raid at Nauru, and we sent an aeroplane out there to see bombing damage after. And he comes on the island of Nauru, and there's a submarine on the surface. And he expects to be one of ours, and he goes down low, and of course it has a rising sun on it. And he turns around, and by the time he gets back, the submarine's gone, of course, and he just has 500-pound bombs. Well, he comes back to Guadalcanal, and he's debriefed by this very conscientious intelligence officer we had. And so he writes this report that goes to Admiral Nimitz and then goes to Com-Inch, which to us in Guadalcanal was known as E. Jesus King. You might probably know it. So the commanding officer of Bombing Squadron 106 gets a direct message from the Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet. You will comply with SP-202 unless otherwise directed. Well, we don't have a book on Guadalcanal, and I don't know what SP-202 is. So I don't pay much attention to it. But we go on, and on one of my trips, I finally get over to Milne Bay with my submarine friends, and I read SP-202, and it says you will attack every submarine unless he shows an identification signal. This is the Battle of the Atlantic, of course, but I go back and tell my boys, look, if you ever see any submarine, why you attack it. Well, time goes on, and we're up in New Guinea, and then we go to the Admiralty Islands, and the fleet's coming through to Palau, and one of my planes come on, submarine on the surface, and down he goes, shooting his 50 calibers, and it's the USS Skate. Well, about 4 days later, a bird colonel shows up. I'm a young commander, and he comes in and he shows me this message from Nimitz to MacArthur, saying, this is the 7th U.S. submarine that's been attacked in your area. Will you please do something about it? Well, I turned to the colonel, and I said, have you read SP-202? Well, the colonel didn't answer. He went back, and I didn't hear anything else about it. But time goes on, and I go back. We're finally coming home, and I land at Kaneohe, and I see this very nice gentleman standing in shorts there, and I wondered who he's coming to greet. And it's Admiral Nimitz. And he greeted every commanding officer that came back from the war. So he takes me over to his quarters, and we have drinks, and he takes me to his staff meeting the next morning. And we're sitting around, and the first thing that comes up, what do I think of the Japanese aviators? And at that particular time, I wasn't thinking too fast, but I said, well, I just shot down a Jake, and he probably was the staff guy out getting his flying time. Submarine story, and I said, I finally told my people, if you don't see a submarine, I don't care whether you're waving the Emperor's hat or what, just don't look at it, see? So Admiral Nimitz in his quiet father turns to the commander of the submarine force, Admiral Lockwood, and says, Charlie, what did we do about SC-202? And he sends the Marine orderly to go out and find about SB-202, and there it is. And it turns out that, of course, it had never been promulgated to the Pacific Fleet. It was Atlantic, the Battle of the Atlantic, and that's what you did in the Atlantic, because you didn't do that in the Pacific. I was dying to go back to the war as carrier air group commander, and my friend Forrest Sherman came up and says, Chick, it's time you went home.
Any comment from the end, Al or Joe Fame? We're a bit in the operational business, but is there anything you want to add here? Either one?
The operation, perhaps continuing, Jack, a little bit with some of the problems we attacked earlier on the way. I happen to have in front of me a letter from General Doolittle back to the States that sort of took the B-24 apart and had glowing reports about this other one. But he said the last paragraph, 12 paragraphs, we're satisfied that the B-24 is basically an excellent airplane, but are convinced that radical immediate changes must be made to assure its continued usefulness. And I did happen to get a hold of, not the initials that Chick had here, but a reply from Arnold, General Arnold, and at the very end he says, we're going to make the airplane better, the remedial actions will be taken and eliminate the shortcomings such as move the navigator, put side vision panels for the bombardier, develop a new type of fairing for the nose, a new pilot's canopy with V windshield, similar to this other airplane. Plans to replace tail turret with a belt, power boost mount, single tail installation, been tested at Eglin Field and made the airplane as easy as the other airplane to fly, and armor plate to be replaced by flat curtains. I just want to go on record. We have an MCR for every one of those things. We had pretty well engineered. In fact, we were flying this single tail 2 years before, we even got up to the automobile maker. And we weren't allowed to stop the line to do this. We had nose revisions in Tucson and San Diego. They were done in the mod centers over in the 8th Air Force. kind of drawings and pictures of all those ball turrets in the nose, and it looked very, very fine. But we could never get a ball turret. It was never allowed to take it, and we had to live with the old big old primary tail turret in the nose for the J's coming off the line, which was horrible, ugly, drag, and everything else. But we never could get those parts, and they would never let us stop the line long enough. And here we had 3 other companies, at least, producing a lot of airplanes. And it would seem to me, as you heard, became a surplus, and certainly we could make those changes and get a better flying airplane. The Navy had a single tail, and I think it did a pretty good job, right? So I just wanted to read that before it came to a close, because we tried, believe me, we really tried. And it happened to try again, I guess.
Go ahead.
While we're in the reading letters portion here, I have a quickie. This is from General Willis Hale to General Stratemeyer. Dear Strat, I have recently returned from a protracted trip to the Solomons and elsewhere to find on hand a large 2-page letter signed by General Arnold regarding the attitude of some personnel with reference to the B-24. He had particular reference to the personnel of the bombardment group who are now departing from here to enter an active combat zone. He directed me to take positive action to counteract any impression that may exist that the B-24 may be an inferior combat plane. Please inform him that I have taken the following action in this regard. A. Group commander and 1 squadron commander have been relieved. That's one way. It's the love it or leave it philosophy.
Very good. How about the vulnerability of this airplane? A, the flag. I think we know the ditching story was unfortunately not a very good one. How about defensive ability then against fighters? Who would like to comment here? Joe Pax?
Let me pick up and add a footnote to what I said about the low-level Ploesti mission. I think that pretty well demonstrated to us that that was not the way for us with B-24s to attack heavily defended Nazi positions like the Romanian oil fields. We later deployed the 15th Air Force to fields in southern Italy after we got a foothold there, and they attacked the Ploesti oil refineries 22 times before they were finally completely put out of commission against very, very heavy defenses. Eventually, the 15th Air Force B-24 fleet was about the same size, and I believe just had slightly more B-24s down there in that command than we did in the 2nd Air Division in the 8th Air Force. And they became just as experienced and just as expert with the B-24 as did the 8th Air Force up in England. I want to make one comment about an aspect of World War II that I think we tend to overlook a bit, and that is the Battle of the Atlantic. I looked up some figures about what was happening in 1941, 42, 43, and you may remember that if you were based in the United States, somewhere around the coast, especially the Atlantic coast, that beginning in 42, after we came into the war, the German U-boats were sinking shipping right off the coast. And it's interesting to go back and review some of the actions and some of the statistics. When the war started, the Germans had just 55 U-boats, but they pretty soon stepped up production, and throughout the whole of World War II, they lost 823 subs. And during the first half of 1942, the Allies lost 506 ships, equal to 3 million tons of shipping, about 3 ships every day. In that period, the Allies only destroyed 21 U-boats. So the tide was really turning, And the Battle of the Atlantic, if it had gone the other way, could well have decided the whole contest. However, in the beginning, in the first half of 43, the tide began to turn, and one of the reasons it began to turn was because the Very Long-Range Liberator was coming into service and was being coordinated with the British Navy, and some new techniques were developed, and so the German U-boats began to get the worst end of the bargain. In May, just 1 month, 1943, 41 U-boats were sunk, more than the whole of the previous year. 21 of those were by air attack, 15 by the Coastal Command, using, to some extent, the VLR, Long-Range Liberator. We had a phenomenal record in the United States in producing shipping. In 1941, we produced 1 million tons. In 1942, 8 million tons. And in 1943, 19 million tons. So it was just, it was a monumental effort on the part of production on the one hand, getting the upper hand with better techniques and with the help of a Very Long-Range Liberator in the hands of the Coastal Command. The U.S. Navy played a very strong role in the Battle of the Atlantic, of course, and of those 823 subs of the Germans that were destroyed, the British sank 524, the U.S. Navy 126, U.S. Air Force 54, and about 100 other subs were lost to operational accidents, mines, and so on. But that was a critical part of the war that we tend to not think about too much, and the Liberator played a very important role there.
Thank you, General Potts. We've now talked about the co-star of this whole 4 days deliberations, the airplane. Note, however, the most and as important co-star are you people. I thought maybe you would like to maybe come and ask some questions. There are microphones strategically located around the hall. They are not active until I call on you. If you would like to proceed to them and tell us, first of all, your name and unit identification, and then tell us to whom you'd like to address the question. It could be to any specific panel member. It could be to all of them as you see fit. So I'll try to recognize you as you make your way to the microphones. They're numbered. I'm not sure I can see them with these bright lights, since the eyes are the second thing to go. But we'll at least then go over and we'll recognize them, the gentleman here on number 1. Please go ahead. Number 1, Mike.
Sir, with all due respect, I say again, would you reintroduce the gentleman for the people that came in late and the people that are hard of hearing?
Certainly, I'll be happy to do so. Thank you. On your right, the gentleman on the far end, Mr. Al Blue, a civilian who's written extensively on this since 1960, done 2 unit histories, and his volume, The Liberator, published in 1976, still pretty much the standard work on it. The next gentleman then moving, obviously, from your right to your left, Mr. Joe Famé, a leading engineer on the B-24, later on then became the president of Convair before his retirement, and was very instrumental and was overseas a good bit of 1944 advising General Doolittle on the utilization of the B-24 in the European theater. The gentleman in the middle then, Vice Admiral John Hayward, U.S. Navy, class of 1930 of the Naval Academy, extensive carrier experience, and then the commanding officer of VB-106, spending more than 2 years in the South Pacific in charge of naval operations with the B-24. The 4th gentleman then, counting from right to left, Group Captain John Musgrave, an RAF officer, evacuated Dunkirk as an Army officer, learned to fly at the time of the Battle of Britain, and had extensive operations then and utilization of the Liberator II, Liberator III, and Mark VI in India, in the Middle East, and in Italy. Served a tour, incidentally, with the U.S. Navy before his retirement at Sac Land. And the final gentleman on your far left, Major General Ramsey D. Potts, a commander of two of Liberator groups, went over with the 93rd, and I'll have to look at my numbers to come up with the two groups. Ramsey, if you'll forgive me, as I reach through this to come up with the 453rd and the 389th. And of course participated on 1 August 1943 in the low-level Ploesti raid. I hope this helps. Can we move? Is there somebody I can see at microphone 2, please?
My name is R.D. Jew, and I was with the 389th Bomb Group, and I would like to ask General Potts why we had removed a lot of the ball turrets from that group.
Can everybody hear the question? And I won't take the time to repeat it then. General Potts, please.
Well, I wanted to see what the ball turret was like, and so I said, well, I'd like to get up and fly in that position on a practice mission. And after I flew in the ball turret on a practice mission, I said, hell, it's humanly impossible for anybody to function in that turret very well. And so I said, let's take them off the airplane. Now that's really not a true story.
I'll go to microphone number 10 on my right.
I don't know why they were taken off, except that the airplanes were getting so heavy. I guess somebody in a higher command decided we better take some weight off. I honestly don't know.
Number 10.
Wasn't the reason?
Sorry, go ahead, John.
If you were going to make a low altitude attack, nobody's going to come underneath you and shoot at that altitude. I mean,
we only did that one low altitude attack. The rest of the time we were flying up in high altitude.
Number 10, Mike.
This is number 3. Is it open?
Yes, it says number 10 to me.
Yeah, well, it says 3 down there. And
That adds up to 13. Go ahead.
first of all, I would like to advise the moderator that there is a B-24 in the Pima Air Museum in Tucson, Arizona, where we hope to hold a reunion, 7th Bomb Group.
We won't charge for your commercial, but go ahead.
All right. My name's Emil Gavlak, and I flew with 436th in India. And those people in India thought that airplane had a tremendous engine. And I haven't heard much about the performance of the engines on that airplane and how much it enhanced the quality of the airplane. Does anyone care to comment on engines?
the engine was one of the best. The 1830, and we had the turbo. Couldn't find a better engine. I thought we never had any real engine problems at all. Very few.
One of the great stories of World War II, in my opinion, is that we had this great engine in the B-24, and we had some remarkably splendid crew chiefs and maintenance personnel who kept those things running through all kinds of
Thank you, General Potts. How about number 4, Mike? I can see, I hope there's a gentleman standing there.
Yes, sir. My name is Bob Nolan. I'm from the 486 Bomb Group, and I, like Jack, was a navigator in the other aircraft. However, I have one saving grace. My bomb group, the 486, was first equipped with B-24s and later with B-17s. I would like to ask General Potts if you'd care to comment on one thought that occurred to me. With the weight of the aircraft increasing, what impact, if any, was apparent in your ability to conduct formation flying, and the fact that since we dropped on lead aircraft, bombing accuracy?
Well, you heard Mr. Fomé say that he went over as an advisor to General Doolittle. General Doolittle took command of the 8th at the beginning of 1944. And earlier, I commented on the fact that the operational personnel who were planning the missions in the 8th were almost entirely B-17 people familiar with the characteristics of that airplane. The airplane got heavier, the B-24 got heavier, and we were finding it more and more difficult to fly at high altitudes of 26,000 feet in formation. And so I think our bombing accuracy did drop off for a while in the B-24s. But after General Doolittle got me down there, the 8th Air Force headquarters, he didn't need Mr. Fomé anymore. And I told you what I did in planning the bombing missions of the 8th Air Force for the last 5 months of the war. It was just the fact that the B-17 was a better high-altitude bomber over Europe than the B-24 was. The B-24 was better in other theaters and in other uses, but as a high-altitude bomber over Europe, the B-17 was a better platform, no doubt about it.
See how we convert these people eventually? How about I'll go...
I do want to say one thing, though.
Please go ahead, Ramsey.
It took better pilots to fly the B-24.
Let me go to number 8 back here, please. I'll try to work everybody in, so be patient with us. Go ahead, please. Hold on. Is the mic active, please? Activate number 8, please. Okay, go ahead.
Bob Meyer, 44th Bomb Group. I would like to ask the group captain how the B-24 compared with the British Lancaster bomber as far as bomb load and range.
I didn't fly Lancasters during the war. I flew Lancasters for a short time after the war. And I always left with the impression that the Lancaster was a more rugged war machine than the B-24. And I'm not saying that to decry B-24. It carried a heavier load than the B-24. The Lancaster carried a greater load. From memory, I think we could carry 10 or even 14,000 pounds of bombs on the Lancaster. But the Lancaster did not have the range of the B-24. And really, that is why the B-24s were never deployed in the UK with the RAF Bomber Command. Right from the very start, in 1939, 1940, the British were interested in the B-24 because of its long-range potential. And that interest and attitude towards the B-24 persisted right through the war, and that is why the bomber aircraft were deployed in the Middle East and Far East. To be accurate, they did have a few B-24s within the RAF Bomber Command that were not used in the bomber role. They were used in the bomber support role with radio countermeasures. Neither did the Lancaster have the potential for high altitude that the B-24 had. But as I remarked previously, that was partly as a result of a different philosophy between the RAF and Americans. The RAF, from the beginning, at the beginning, attempted daylight raids with great losses and turned to night raids primarily. And that is why we were content with the Lancaster's role as not being a high altitude bomber.
All right, I think the gentleman at number 2 microphone has been standing maybe as long as anybody else. Will you activate 2 and please give us your question, sir?
Yes, Bob Duncan. I was with the 451st Bomb Group, and in June and July of '44. My question is not meant as criticism. I enjoyed flying the airplane and still think it's a good airplane. However, on ferrying across a new plane across to my unit, and on some of the missions after that, we had trouble when we were transferring fuel from the inside the wingtips, the tip tanks, to our main engines. And when we transfer it to, say, for instance, number 4 engine, that engine might quit it in 10 seconds or a minute and a half. You'd have to shut that one off and go to another one. I never found out what the reason was. Does anybody have that explanation, please?
Anybody be able to help the gentleman? Joe, go ahead.
No, I'm not familiar with, you said tip tank?
The tanks, the Tokyo tanks inside the tips.
Bombay.
Bombay tank.
Now you're talking outer wing, are you not?
Inside the tips.
One's in the outer panel?
In the outer panel of the wings.
We never had any problems with the fuel system. Bombay tanks, we really had to be sure they were hooked up correctly, but we never had anything with the self-contained, the 2,300 gallon load.
Well, some people might not have, but I had several missions where I had to land before I got back because we could not get any of that fuel out.
Apparently not been a problem shared by others, at least on the panel. Let me go to number 10, and then I'll come back to number 1. Activate 10, please. Go ahead, sir.
My name is Leslie Jansen. I served under General Potts in the 389th, so I want to address my question to him on a subject he briefly touched. I believe the B-24 flying at a lower altitude was under the range of the German anti-aircraft for a longer period of time than the B-17. Would you care to elaborate on that?
Well, if you're in that range of from about 20 to 24,000 feet, the German ACAC, I think, did have a better chance of hitting you than if you got up around 27, 28,000. But it was just very difficult to get our planes up there and fly formation at that altitude, even with a diminished bomb load. I don't know how to comment any further except to say that you're right. You are more likely to be knocked down by ACAC if you were in that, if you ran into the same concentration. The trick was to, what we tried to do in planning the missions was to pack as many airplanes as we could over the target in a shorter period of time so that the guns on the ground wouldn't have a chance to, let's say, shoot at you twice or 3 times, and shoot once, and then we'd get the whole force through. Now you had to modify that concept in order to be sure that you weren't running into each other over the target area, or so that you could bomb accurately. But the German concentrations of ACAC were different over different targets, and they would shift, they'd shift their anti-aircraft around. I can remember, for instance, when the Germans started firing V-1s and V-2s into England after the invasion had taken place, and the 8th Air Force was put on the mission of going after those targets, which we call no-ball targets. And initially, everybody thought, boy, these are going to be milk runs. Wonderful. We won't have to make these deep penetrations. But the Germans concentrated so much anti-aircraft over those targets that it turned out that those missions were just about as risky as the longer penetrations.
Thank you. We'll go to number 1. Activate number 1, please.
My name's Roger Ellis. And first of all, I'd like to say that we did lose an airplane coming back across the Pacific in the 307 bomb group because we couldn't get the fuel out of the wing tanks. I did want to ask Mr. Joe Fume if he recalls one of the additions and what the genesis was for the formation stick that miraculously showed up on the new Jays coming in to the South Pacific there, and after asking the ground crew what they were for, we weren't sure ever, but we were wondering who used them and what was the original requirement for them.
I didn't understand what he...
Will you repeat your question, please?
Maybe we had the only airplane with the formation sticks, so you could fly the airplane with the autopilot rather than by hand. Does anybody else remember the formation sticks?
You're asking why it was there?
Yes.
Well, it was just another change they put in, you know. They asked, and we did it. I don't know. I've never heard of problems, but...
Thank you, Joe. Number 7. Will you activate number 7, please? You're live, I hope.
No.
Yes, you are.
My name is Jim McAteer. I flew with the 90th Bomb Group in the Southwest Pacific. I have a comment for Mr. Joe Fume. I actually flew in a B-24 where the heater worked.
You're a very fortunate man. I would like to ask you, however, did you fly in an airplane that had the hot air de-icing system?
Yes, sir.
And the heater didn't work?
I said I compliment Consolidated. The heater did work. No, I really, Joe, I had another comment.
Yes.
The B-24 was acknowledged to be very flexible as far as different modifications are concerned. I think that is one of the reasons it made the impact that it did in the various theaters. I wonder if you were familiar with the role that General Connell played in making the very first adaptation of a tail turret into the nose turret in early or mid-1943, with all due respect to the Admiral and the Navy's work.
Joe? Well, we knew that there had been some modifications to put that. It was, I believe, the Convair tail turret or the motor products. And it was not one which we're very proud of because aerodynamically it was pretty bad. But that's what they wanted. And we were unable to get Urco turrets in supply. And again, we could not get the small ball turret that we could change the nose. And had that been possible, we were ready for it, but we couldn't get it. It went to the other airplane.
Well, Mr. Fume, I settled for having a heater that worked. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right. Would you activate number 3, please? 3.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm Dave Burton. I was a pilot with the 376 out of Italy. And it's inconceivable to me, and I would like to ask anyone in the panel, why the political decision was made to destroy every one of the B-24s so that we're scrounging around getting pieces and parts when they kept some of the B-17s. How come that was made? Was Boeing a part of that political decision?
Glad you brought that up.
Pure jealousy.
I'd like to know, does anybody know why they had to destroy every one? They didn't even save any for museums or anything. We just happened to have a few around. Was there any answer to that?
I've been through the Arnold papers. There are 300 boxes out in the Library of Congress, and as well as Spots, who have been involved in this decision. And there's no record of this. There's no indication that this was done on a conscious basis. That doesn't mean it wasn't done. I'm just saying there's no record of it. Number 4, please.
My name is Holiday, and I was with the 376th in Italy. And earlier, I think there was a comment that about 20,000 feet was as high as you could go with a bomb load, a full load of fuel. Well, we had a little better luck down in Italy because we usually, most all of our bombing missions were at 28,000 feet. And of course, we had a long ways to fly, a lot longer distance to fly than they did out of the 8th Air Force. And we had more time to get to altitude, so most of ours was from 28,000 feet.
Comment by any of the panel members? None? Thank you for your comment. So now, there used to be a quiz show man named Dr. IQ who always said the most interesting things. He said, "I have a lady in the balcony." I don't see anybody up there, however, raising a question. Let's go to number 1, please.
My name is Claiborne Waldrop. I'm an American who flew with Coastal Command of the RAF, VLR Squadron Lee-Light equipped. I'd like to ask 2 questions. One, the gentleman from the factory, why they bolted the fire extinguisher in the nose under the navigator's table, so when he drew a course line, he always hit a hex nut on a board.
No editorial comments, just ask the question.
My second question is, I was told, but it might have been a rumor, that there was a very good coffee pot that came with B-24s. I flew 67 combat sorties. I never saw a coffee pot. Did any B-24 pilot present here ever receive a B-24 ready for combat with a coffee pot still in it?
Here's a hand here. He probably still has the coffee pot, too. Joe, go ahead, please, and then we'll go to John Musgrave.
Well,
Joe Famay.
First question, I take the 5th. I don't know why it was there, really. On the other hand, if you need a coffee pot, I'll get one.
We just stole them from the PBY.
John Musgrave, are you going to make a comment?
Well, this was an excellent opportunity to for me to make a comment about Coastal Command and the Liberator in the maritime role. And just before we ended the more formal part of our discussion, General Potts drew attention to the great work the Liberator did in the maritime role. And I wanted to add to that some remarks, because I feel perhaps our discussion concentrated rather overmuch on the Liberator and the bomber role and not enough on the Liberator and the maritime role. Within the RAF, this was a big political problem. The concept of the air staff was that these long-range aircraft had been obtained as bombers. And even before they arrived, there was constant demand from the commanding general of the Coastal Command for more aircraft to deal with this U-boat threat in the Atlantic. And he never got the forces he really needed. He got units borrowed from Bomber Command. And all his pleas to the higher air staff were, I must have these long-range aircraft, even if it means a reduction of the Bomber Command force. And the answer he repeatedly got was that the Bomber Command is doing more to destroy German industry and its capacity to produce the U-boats, which wasn't convincing, as you can imagine, to the Coastal Command. But when the Liberators arrived, the first Liberators, the Liberator 1s, were not really suitable for the bomber role, and that is why they first went to be used in the coastal maritime role. But that critical time in 1942, when the whole of Britain could have been brought to its knees as a result of the U-boat war, that problem was overcome by units taken from bomber command units and from American bomber units to deal with this gap in the Atlantic, which was not sufficiently covered by maritime aircraft. Our early liberators were able to put in air surface vessel radar, and that made a tremendous difference. The radar was improved by the Americans, and by 1942 we had that coverage and led to the successes which General Potts surveyed. Whilst I'm on the air, could I make a social comment? If there are any people in the hall, I'm sure with an audience of this size there are other RAF aircrew who flew the Liberator, if not RAF from the British Commonwealth Air Forces. I do hope they'll try and make contact with me afterwards.
I would answer about part of the agreement with King and Arnold. One of the reasons this bombing situation, at first they were talking just about the Pacific, but quickly the Battle of the Atlantic, as the General pointed out, Squadron 103, 105, 107 were formed and sent to the Atlantic and went to the Coastal Command in England and operated from there. And there were 36 of 48 of the aircraft. That was part of it, and we were then directed that we were not to be in the bombing business.
Thank you. Since I made the comment about the balcony, I think I should call on, it's not a lady up there, but it's a gentleman, if my eyes hold true. Let's activate number 5, please.
My questions are to Mr. Fumet, two of which. My name is King Schultz. I was a pilot with the 448th Bomb Group. And when I got back to California in April of 1945, after a combat tour, an engineer from Consolidated, was a family friend, invited me through the engineering department. And I saw some enhancements there that I would ask you to comment on, several, one of which was an enhancement to take the exhaust from the turbo and run it at the trailing edge of the wing to give the airplane some boost. And so if you'd comment on that. And the second one, though, is that afterwards these engineers took me to lunch, and he said, "What do you think of the B-24? I said,
we did put turbo hoods on the air. We had them available because that would, for the night flying, for one thing, to take the red donut that we could see, 4 donuts flying along, we put a turbo hood on, and it would, we thought, give it a little bit more, at least reduce the drag from the long telephone poles. I look at it, dragging these 4 poles behind it. And I was talking to Alan here this afternoon. I showed him pictures of this turbo hood that I think would have done what you're talking about. I doubt if much jet force would come out.
Thank you. If you are called upon to be a moderator, what you should do then is, first of all, get a wonderful audience such as you have been. And secondly, be blessed then with a marvelous expert group of panelists such as we've been blessed with tonight. I'm afraid we have to cut off the formal question and answer period, but I think the panelists will be here. Most of us are walking back to our hotels, but there are buses outside. Again, you're the co-stars of this. Thank you for coming, and to the panel, thank you for such wonderful